And now I'm recording. So today we're going to finish Plato, uh, and then we're going to move on to Descartes. So I don't want to spend too much time. We've spent a good amount of time. If you watched the last lecture, the one that I gave on Thursday last week at 1 p.m., and I posted it pretty shortly thereafter. If you watched that lecture and you got to the end of it, you heard all the stuff I said about Plato's metaphysics, namely Plato's what's known as Plato's theory of forms. Okay, and so I'm going to recap that briefly, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. What I'd like to do today is wrap up Plato pretty quick, talk about some of, what is his theory, what is his approach to metaphysics, how does he see reality fundamentally, what are some problems with that approach, and then we're going to segue as briefly as we can. It's going to be pretty hard to do this briefly, but we're going to segue from the classical or ancient philosophy of the Greeks to the more modern philosophy of the Europeans, Descartes, the scientific revolution, all that stuff. And there's a lot of history between those two periods. So I'm skipping quite a bit, but that's not a big deal. This is an intro class. It's not meant to get super in depth, but I feel like there's definitely some background information we need to cover. Think I'm right about this, in order for you to fully appreciate Descartes when we get to Descartes. So for next class, if you haven't already, you need to get a copy of his book or find a different version of it. Doesn't really matter. Read Descartes' first meditation, because we will definitely get to that next time on Thursday at 1 p.m. So that's when I'll be recording the lecture, the first lecture for Descartes' meditation. And then a week from today at this time at 11, we'll probably move on and we'll do the second meditation a week from today. So as I said, we're going to briefly re-examine Plato and his sort of overall metaphysics, some problems with it, and then kind of segue to the moderns. So last class we wrapped up the symposium, and I ended really at the what might be the most, one of, maybe not the most, but one of the most famous passages from the symposium, the one that's often referred to as the ladder of love. This is the passage where Diotima is telling Socrates how to go about seeking beauty in the proper way, how to cultivate the right approach such that one can achieve true love of true beauty. And what this entails, it seems, is a slow detachment from the physical and an ascension into the intellectual, the non-physical, that which can be the beauty that can be seen through our senses versus the beauty that can be understood through our intellect, through our soul, if you want to use the term that pops up quite a bit in Plato. So what exactly is it that we are achieving when we get to the top of this ladder of love? Well, it's a sort of knowledge, it's a sort of wisdom. It's a wisdom about the true nature of how things are. And so when Plato talks about forms, and I don't think he uses, at least in this version of the dialogue that we've been reading, don't think he uses the term forms that often, if at all. But if you've ever read The Republic or you read some of his other works, mid to late Plato, you do get this term eidos. The forms are spoken of quite frequently, and it's pretty obvious that this description that we get of the beautiful at the towards the end of the symposium is a description of the form of beauty. Now, what are forms? We briefly touched on this last time, but and I'm going to have to keep it really simple. There might be like people who, watch this video later and that know a little bit more about Plato, and they say, well, you kind of dumbed it down. Well, yeah, I did dumb it down. This is an intro class, whatever. But they're basically, forms are, you can think of them as ideas, but they're a special kind of idea. It's not just like you made up some thought in your head. These ideas are independent. If you review the passage I read at the end of class, or towards the end last time, where we get this description of the beautiful, he talks about beauty as being itself, by itself, in itself, apart from all other things. So everything that is beautiful insofar as it partakes, or sometimes he says participates in this form of the beautiful. But the beautiful itself really is independent and separate from all the beautiful things. So the forms, whether we're talking about the form of beauty, the form of, there are many forms, the form of goodness, there might be even more basic forms like the form of square, the form of triangle, the form of circle. Again, these are just ideas. They're not physical things, but they are concepts, ideas that are universal, and they have an independent existence that is above us, right? Above, not literally, but in a higher realm that is not physical, that is outside of time and space. And these forms are what helps us understand all the individual things. So when I see a beautiful body, or a beautiful sunset, or a beautiful work of art, or I hear a beautiful symphony, all of these are different things, and they all have beauty in a different way. And they might not be beautiful on certain days, or from certain angles, or from a certain perspective. But the beautiful itself is just beautiful. It always is. And its beauty does not depend on any relation to anything else. And also, all the things I mentioned, as I said, that they might be contextually beautiful. They might be only beautiful if you can understand them. Only beautiful if you develop enough taste to appreciate them. Only beautiful if you look at them in a certain angle. Whatever. There's all these qualifications. There's all these contingencies that have to be arrived at in order for the beauty to work. Whereas the beautiful itself is just eternally beautiful. And this is the point I was getting at when I got a little sidetracked there. This form of beauty, according to Plato, he argues, is what gives us any sort of understanding of anything that we consider beautiful. So when I see the beautiful person, oh, look at that beautiful girl, that beautiful woman, or look at that beautiful sunset, I understand what I'm talking about. I have this understanding of beauty, and that understanding is directly related to my understanding of the form of beauty. It's my understanding of the idea, the concept, this universal concept of beauty, that allows me to recognize the beauty in the particular things. And the beauty in the particular things is always deficient. It's always imperfect. Everything in the physical world is always imperfect in some sense, says Plato. You're never going to find a perfect circle. There are no perfect circles in nature. There are no perfect circles in time and space. They're always going to be off slightly. But the concept of circle is always the same. It doesn't change. It's, always 360 degrees. The relationship between the circumference and the diameter is always pi. It's always the ratio of pi. And, these are just eternal truths that don't depend upon anything but themselves to be true. And this is where I think some people misunderstand Plato's point or his theory here. He's not saying that the forms are ideas in your head, per se. The ideas in your head are based on the forms. The forms are independent. And they are even more real than the ideas in your head. And so there's a sort of hierarchy in the universe of reality. If we go back to this ladder of love, not only does he want to say that this beauty at the top is more beautiful and the most beautiful, but it is the only thing that is truly beautiful. And everything else is a somewhat deficient or lower copy of beauty, or a sort of imitation or insufficient approximation of true beauty. And this is always the case in the world around us, the temporal spatial world, the physical world. It always falls short of perfection, but not the higher realm, not the realm of forms. And it's through the understanding, our soul, our intellect understands this intelligible realm of forms. It's through that understanding of the realm of forms that we're able to navigate and understand the physical world, the world that's always changing, that's always waxing and waning, as he says in the symposium, right? These beautiful bodies, these beautiful things, they're waxing and waning, they're changing, but not the beautiful itself. If you destroyed all the beautiful things, beauty itself would still be. Just like all the dodo birds are gone, but the idea of dodo bird still exists. We can still talk about it and understand it, say scientifically true things about this biological being. So there's this hierarchy in the universe, and as we get higher and higher up the ladder, things become more abstract. They become less physical, less tangible, and for Plato, they become more real. So we can sort of reinterpret that allegory of the cave that we talked about last semester. I mentioned this, I think, at the end of the video. If you watched the last lecture video, you know, that this rise out of the cave it's from the physical world, which is really for Plato the world of shadows, which that's kind of counterintuitive. We seem to like really believe in reality in the physical, what our senses. You know, there's a saying, I'm sure some of you, most of you probably heard it, seeing is believing. Or maybe you've heard perception is reality. People tend to really believe what they see, but Plato was a skeptic about that. He thought that actually appearances are illusory. The world around us is constantly shifting and constantly changing. It's never in a constant, stable state, in such a state that you could really know it eternally and know it for what it always is. But the world of forms is stable, static, true at all times. What makes a circle doesn't change. 2 plus 2 is 4, always. Plato's arguments, I think, are much more intuitive when we limit ourselves to mathematical and geometrical examples. When we expand it, it's a little bit harder to understand where he's coming from. But he's going to be pretty insistent that no, forms have even more reality than these things. I want to say, well, look, it seems like this pen that I'm holding in my hand is more real, is more tangible than me thinking about the concept of what a pen is. If I just contemplate intellectually what it is to be a pen, I guess I'm trying to understand the form. What is it about all these different things that makes them pens, regardless of whether they're this thing or whether they're this thing or whether they're this, they all look the same, but I know they're different. I know that they're all each individual objects. So why do I call them a pen? For Plato, there's this concept, there's this idea, there's this form that allows me to understand and to recognize these objects as the objects they are, as a pen. Now, if you're someone like Aristotle, you're going to say, well, you just call them the same name because they have the same function. You use them for the same purpose, namely to write. That's why you call all these things chairs, because you're sitting on them, right? You wouldn't give everything its own name. And so the idea for Aristotle is something that is just, it is derived from experience in a certain sense. You have experiences of all these different things, and there's a pattern that emerges. There are certain features that jump out. In the case of a pen, namely its functionality. I write with it. But Plato says you couldn't even have a pen. You couldn't have really anything in the universe without the idea coming first. So for Plato, the idea takes precedent. In fact, he often speaks of the idea. This is, I think, another thing about him that's a bit counterintuitive, but he often speaks of the idea as the cause of the thing. So the idea of a pen caused excuse me, I got the hiccups. The idea of a pen caused the pen. And this is true of everything. The idea of the desk caused the desk. The idea of a tree caused the tree. Sometimes I can kind of, see how that's straightforward and it makes sense, and other times it's kind of mysterious. In a manner of speaking, I guess you can say, okay, so someone had an idea before there ever were pens ever invented. Somebody needed to write something. They might have got a twig off the ground and dipped it in some I don't know, some liquid that was colorful. Who knows what kind of liquid, right? Whatever worked. And then they used it to paint the cave walls. But that was not very practical. You had to find good twigs, some that were sharp, some that were, whatever. And eventually, throughout history, this sort of writing utensil became more and more refined. And, it was through insight. It was through this idea. What Plato is going to say is that there was always a perfect pen. That's the form, the concept of pen. And each of these writing utensils was an approximation of it. And the people who invented them, each of these, I guess, starting with the twig and turning into the fountain pen, and and then the ballpoint pen, the modern pen, each of these was a sort of improvement, and they were all trying to get better. But what made the pen better was just true. It's always going to be true. What makes a pen a good pen is universally true in all cases, for all time. That doesn't change. So our intellectual understanding of that is what guides us when we invent these things. Aristotle kind of seems to reverse the process. It's through practice, it's through engagement, it's through trial and error, and sort of seeing what works and what doesn't in practice. That's how our theories are developed and our ideas are developed. But for Plato, the process is reversed. Theory, concepts, the forms, the ideas are not only the things that allow us human beings to understand our universe, but they are the cause. They are the literal cause of the universe. So just like in the allegory of the cave story, if you remember way back to the beginning of the semester, when we covered Plato's cave myth allegory, just like the bonfire in the cave and the puppets that all the people with the in the procession are holding up, just like those puppets in the fire are what cause the shadows that the prisoners see in the cave. The forms, these eternal, unchanging, perfect forms, they are what cause the shadow that is the world we live in. This physical, sensible, visible world that we have access to through our body, through our senses. So this might actually be some more, I don't know if you remember, because it seems like we keep getting we keep getting these obstacles thrown in our way, whether it's just with technology or weather. But if you remember back when we were covering the Apology, and I mentioned that Plato, Socrates, they seem to advocate a form of asceticism. That is, they advocated a lifestyle that was detached from physical, sensual pleasure and focused on spiritual or intellectual pursuits. This is more, I guess, of an argument for that approach, because what's really real, what has the most reality in the universe, is the non-physical, is this sort of abstract realm of forms, this is more of an argument for why one should detach yourself from your body and detach yourself. That's turning away from this world of illusion, this sort of shadow world of the physical that we're stuck in until we die, maybe, and then our soul is released from the body. Turn away from that world and focus your light on the light of truth, being, the good, the beautiful, all these higher forms. So when it comes to this world for Plato, we can't really have any knowledge of nature. All we can really have are beliefs and opinions, because the world's always changing, shifting. It's never in a constant state. And so anything we know about it is not really knowledge. It's just belief or opinion. And you know, we can know all these facts about the physical attributes, let's say, of a particular substance. I could measure, you know, the molecular structure of this pen, all the chemical structure, molecular structure, all, you know, what makes it what it is, like substantively. But the moment I do that analysis, it's already changed. However slightly, it has changed. It may be like a microscopic level, but everything that's physical is always undergoing some sort of change. And even though the Greeks didn't know about atoms, and the Greeks, you know, the ancient Greeks didn't know about, you know, cells and things like that, they did know about decay. They were aware that physical things are not permanent. No matter how durable something is, it doesn't last forever. If you just let it sit there, it's going to decay. Now, for some of these Greek philosophers, that led them to a sort of dismissal of any kind of rigorous pursuit involving an investigation of the natural world. Plato would be one of these. There's other pre-Socratics, so they're just sort of like, you know, forget about nature. There's not much you're going to know about that, because it's always shifting, it's always changing. Instead, try to understand what nature is based on, which are these abstract principles which don't change. What makes a circle, all the properties of a circle are always going to be the same. The properties of a triangle, always going to be the same. And he asserts that what is good and beautiful and all that too, these are eternal truths. These are eternal concepts. So that's what we focus on. When you get to someone like Aristotle, who I warned you last time, I think, I don't want to spend too much time on Aristotle, but it's kind of unavoidable. And when you get to Aristotle, you get a much different approach. Now, Aristotle was, you know, very much influenced by Plato, but he was certainly a philosopher in his own right, with his own views, quite distinct from Plato. He studied at Plato's school in Athens, but he founded his own school, the Lyceum, much later, and his views, you could say, I think it's pretty hard to argue the opposite, but his views were much more influential in the grand scheme of things than Plato. They were both immensely influential. I don't want to belittle the influence of Plato, but it's way overshadowed by Aristotle. By the time we get to Descartes, for sure, you know, which is what I'm trying to like briefly segue to that as much as I can. By the time we get to Descartes, Aristotle's influence has far outseated that of Plato. Now, that wasn't true for a few centuries. In fact, most of Aristotle's work was lost to the West until the Crusades. Till like the 10th, I think, or 11th century, you get like the first few Crusades. And then when Christian crusaders went to Northern Africa, some of the Muslim scholars had preserved Aristotle, and he was rediscovered. But from that point on, Aristotle was sort of he was the man. If you were an educated person in the ancient world, more often than not, you were basing your science, your psychology, your sociology, your politics, your ethics, you're basing it on your religion usually, but coupled with Aristotle, sort of merging your religious belief, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish, I don't know how influential Aristotle was to Jewish theology. That's something I probably shouldn't speak about too much because don't really know. I don't think Maimonides, he was probably one of the biggest names in Jewish theology. I'm not quite sure Maimonides was so influenced by Aristotle or if it was more Platonism. But the point is, though, in the grand scheme of things in the ancient world, there was really nobody second to Aristotle. Now, how is he different from Plato, and how does he approach some of these problems? Well, one thing, he really doesn't like this separation of the forms into some other realm. The idea that there's this higher realm of forms that is separate from the physical, the spatial, temporal realm, the realm of time and space, creates a lot of problems. One of them, and I've already kind of hinted at this, is what is the interaction between the forms and the things? I guess it kind of makes sense to talk about how the form of a pen, the idea of a pen, causes a pen, or the idea of a house causes a house. Sure. I guess you could say something like, well, the person who made the pen knew what they were doing, they had a plan, and they made it. The person who built the house, same thing. They had a blueprint, or they had a design, or whatever, and they set. So the idea caused, in a loose sense of that word, I suppose, the idea caused the thing. But this account doesn't really explain how it is that if the forms are independent, as Plato says they are, if they are in this separate realm all by themselves and they don't interact with the lower forms or the physical things, then how do they cause them? What is the nature of their interaction? If this higher world of forms causes the lower world of the physical, how? How does it do it? How does something that's non-physical bring about something that is? And how does how does the idea of a tree cause a tree? That's kind of a weird, it works kind of well for, man-made objects, pins and, houses and things like that. If a person is making them, then yeah, idea precedes it, then it's made. But a tree, now, Plato, in his cosmology, kind of explains that, well, there is a form of treeness, the perfect tree, the form of tree in Plato's heaven. And yes, all the particular trees in the physical world are imperfect copies of that ultimate ideal tree. And it was created by this Godhead, this mind, this universal mind that Plato um, infers must exist, that there must be this universal mind that understands the forms and is able to organize the construction of the universe in such a way that it's the best universe that you can. So I suppose that this deity understands the form of tree, and all the trees that were created to approximate that as best they can, given the material that they were given to be made out of, or something like that. But even Plato knows that this is just a sort of story that he says in the Timaeus. It's just a likely story. We don't know really the nature of the interaction between this higher realm and the physical. Perhaps we might be able to understand it when we get out of the physical, if we die and our soul can get to this higher realm of forms, then we can see how it all fits together. But it's almost just an article of faith for the Platonists that, yeah, the forms, these higher beings, higher things, whatever you want to call them, these ideas that are outside of time and space, they are what help us understand, make sense of, and they are what cause all that is in time and space, all that is physical. So Aristotle doesn't like this approach, again, because you're sort of separating what can be known from what can be perceived and experienced. There's this big gap between what Aristotle calls the actual world, the world as it is actualized, and the ideal world, this world of ideas, this world of values. He wants to merge the two. For Aristotle, all things in the universe are part form and part matter. The form is not some separate thing, it's embedded in the physical world. All things that exist have a form, they have a shape, they have a purpose, a function, but they also have matter. They also have physical stuff. I'm a man, right? So I have the form of man. I guess I share that with other beings. There are other entities in the universe that are also men, but I happen to be this man. I happen to be made out of the material that I'm made of. I've got my own flesh, my own blood, my own organs, right? My own identity and all this other thing. So I've got my own uniqueness, but then I have other things I share. You know, I'm a part of a species, the human race, right? So obviously, but this is what's interesting for Aristotle. My species is embedded in me. There's something about human nature that's a part of my very being, and that causes me to act the way a human would act. In this case, when we're talking about human beings, I am impelled to act rationally. I am impelled to act reasonably in order to achieve my best and my most fulfilling, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, Status. Status is probably a bad word because that relies on others, but uh, I'm trying to fulfill my highest potential. That's probably a better word. In fact, that's the word that most Aristotle scholars would use. He talks a lot about potential. You know, I'm made of a certain type of substance. Given that type of substance, flesh, blood, a brain, a soul, the ability to think and reason, I'm going to do certain things. I'm going to pursue my own good. And this, I don't know if we want to get it too much into this. It's a bit of a diversion, but my good is also going to be good for my society. Everything kind of fits in for Aristotle into this grand picture. Everything has a purpose, everything has a function, everything is designed. If you look at its nature, if you look at its form, it's designed to fulfill that nature. It's designed to fulfill that form. Human beings, our bodies are designed functionally a certain way. The universe, our hands are functional, right? Our opposing thumbs and fingers are sort of built-in tools. He thinks that the whole universe has a sort of order to it like that, Aristotle, that everything that exists has a higher purpose. And so when you look at some of the science that is based upon Aristotle, and I use the word science very loosely. Modern scientists will scoff at calling Aristotle a scientist in the sort of the modern sense of the word. But the science that was based on Aristotle, when these scholars started to incorporate Aristotle's thought into their theories, there was this assumption, and this is maybe, you could argue, one of the starkest distinctions between the classical approach to philosophy and the modern approach to philosophy, or the classical approach to science and the modern approach to science. But the big focus was everything you were studying as a scientist, as a philosopher, again, had a purpose, had a function. So it wasn't enough to just dissect it, to analyze the organs, all the parts of the animals. Aristotle did that. He did that stuff. You could argue he was one of the first biologists, and cutting open animal carcasses and figuring out how they worked, quote unquote. But there's always an assumption that there's a higher aim. For Aristotle, he thought ultimately there was this deity, this God, the unmoved mover or the prime mover, who was basically the ultimate goal of the universe. Everything was moving towards its own form of perfection. It had a goal. Every human was trying to be the best version of themselves. Things get in the way, of course. That's why we don't always become perfect. Things get in the way. We get bad luck, chance, things like that. But ultimately, every living thing is impelled, and even non-living things, rocks and stuff, they're all impelled to move towards their proper place, to move towards their proper spot in the universe. So the Aristotelian approach, Aristotle's approach to science, to inquiry, is always goal-oriented. We're looking at the goal, And then once we know what the goal is, we can understand the process that leads up to that goal. And that's how we can understand the universe. We can understand history, art. This method works in many fields. When we look at in art, what is the aim of the artist? They were trying to express something. They were trying to make you laugh. They were trying to make you cry. Whatever the aim is, we have to know the aim first. And then once we know the aim, we can understand all the steps that lead up to that aim and whether they were good or bad or actually were fulfilling or unfulfilling and helped us achieve that aim. So that's the basic framework that we're going to get with an Aristotelian approach to the universe. It was quite useful for centuries, for actually a little bit over a millennium, about 1,000 years. Mathematicians, scientists, philosophers, political theorists, they were using Aristotle. It's not that they were just dogmatists that just believed everything Aristotle said, but they used the basic framework, the basic sort of approach to inquiry and knowledge, science, for lack of a better word, that Aristotle used. So the framework, and this doesn't really get challenged until much later, until the scientific revolution. So I've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for just a second. I'm going to open up a new PDF file so we can move on to, we're going to move on to Descartes, kind of. But before we really move on to Descartes, I really do, like I said, I've got to talk a bit about some historical stuff, and namely the scientific revolution. So let's get a PowerPoint going for the scientific revolution. And alas, my screen is freezing. So, okay, cool. Looks like I'm back. I hope. Let me know if you're having any troubles seeing or hearing me. So let's label this Descartes, because I'm only going to talk briefly about the scientific revolution. In fact, we don't have a lot of time left today, so I'm going to give you just a real quick brief overview, and then we'll do a little bit of a more detailed analysis next class on Thursday at 1 p.m. What am I going to title this? I guess I'll just be boring and just write the title of the actual essay, Meditations on First Philosophy. And even though that was lazy and not very creative, let's get a different design going here. Okay, that looks kind of cool, but I'm worried it's going to be like sideways. Let's see what happens when I do a new slide. Is it okay? It's not sideways. Okay, cool. I like that. That's cool. All right, I'm kind of glad, even though I was lazy and uncreative with my subtitle there, Meditations on First Philosophy, I just lifted the title of his essay here. I'm kind of glad I did that because this is a decent segue. Maybe instead of getting into the scientific revolution today, I should briefly talk about some of the distinctions between classical to medieval, and I don't even want to talk much about the medieval, just very briefly. And then finally getting to modern philosophy. Descartes is often referred to as the father of modern philosophy. I can't remember it was who coined that or gave him that title. I think it might have been Martin Buber, but it's controversial. Some don't like that he gets credit for being the father of modern philosophy. I kind of see why he deserves it, though. But I also see why you would be against that and have your reservations. And I'll talk about that probably next time a little bit. But let's just talk about classical versus medieval versus modern philosophy. You know, what I'm calling classical here, sometimes referred to as ancient philosophy. You know, this is before Christianity, basically, right? This is the, you know, we're not really covering the Romans, but you know, Roman philosophy, the sort of later Hellenistic Greek philosophy, and then obviously the ancient, like the real hardcore classical, the pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle. Now, there's a lot of things you can say about, and man, this font is just too small, so let me make this a little bit bigger for you guys to see. Okay, so, and again, I'm painting with some broad brushstrokes here, I'm oversimplifying, but one of the basic differences you can sort of point to is a difference of focus. Now, there's different methodology, different approach. There's a lot of things that are different about these different periods, these different historical periods in philosophy. But one thing, and I'm going to focus on this just because of the title of Descartes' essay, Meditations on First Philosophy. We're going to look at the focus. What was considered first philosophy? First philosophy, that's a term that Descartes is getting from Aristotle. Aristotle in the metaphysics, in the posterior and prior analytics, I think he says it there, the categories, he talks about first philosophy, and he doesn't use the word metaphysics because that word hadn't even been invented yet. But what he is referring to as first philosophy is metaphysics. So you can say that one distinguishing characteristic about the classical approach is that metaphysics is seen as primary. Now, that's debatable, but that's certainly how Aristotle saw it, and you could argue that that's how his predecessor, Plato, saw it. When Plato is doing what appears to be his most serious and most important work, the work that he probably spent most of his time on, and that almost all of his books are working up to, it's the metaphysical stuff. It's the stuff about forms. You know, it's not that ethics and politics aren't important for Plato, but he seems to sort of assert that knowing reality and what's real and the nature of what's real is the first step. That's first philosophy. That's what you do to establish truth, and then you can extract all your other truth from your basic theory of reality. Once you've established your first philosophy, your metaphysics, then all your other philosophies will follow. Your theory of art, your theory of politics, your theory of ethics, etc. Now, when we get to the medieval period, what is considered first philosophy, and I don't know if they would actually use the term first philosophy the way that Aristotle did and the way that Descartes is now revamping, but for them the focus was theology. Okay, and I almost want to bet that someone in here knows what theology is. And I feel like I haven't heard anybody say anything today, so please help me. Show me you're here. Does anybody know what theology is? What is theology? You don't have to give me like a...
Theology, professor, is the study of God.
Good.
Or
Okay.
Shana.
What else? Somebody else is going to say something. That's a good start.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's the study of religion.
Okay, that's probably the second answer is probably technically more correct. The first answer is more literal. I mean, the word in Greek, theos means God, and the word logos, it can mean to study, to explain, to study, to analyze. So, I mean, if you literally translate it, it's to study God. Yeah, but I think, Kaya is a little bit more technically correct. When we talk about theology, it's like studying religion, but to be specific, what we usually mean though is we're studying our own religion. So if you're a theologian, you're a Christian theologian, you're a Christian and you study your own religion. You study, the good book. You study the Bible, and you try to explain, difficult passages, what those might mean. If there's a passage that doesn't seem to fit with another passage, you have to sort of explain why they don't contradict or why, whatever. So theologians is what they do. Now, in the medieval period, the Greek philosophy was still massively influential. Plato was really influential to the early Christians. But once we get to the Crusades, Aristotle has much more of an influence on the Christian church, and it's controversial. A lot of the theologians didn't like the fact that people like Augustine and Aquinas were so much influenced by the Greeks. They didn't like that. They're like, those are pagans. They weren't Christians. You shouldn't really read their philosophy. But they were so impressed by the philosophy, maybe not the religion behind the philosophy. They were so impressed by the Greek philosophy that a lot of medieval thought, a lot of medieval philosophy, some of the more influential stuff it's taking Plato, it's taking Aristotle and integrating it into Christian or Muslim or Jewish doctrine. And so theology was seen as the pinnacle, that you only learn philosophy in order to do theology. So you could argue that theology was not first philosophy, but it was like better than philosophy. It was like philosophy was a tool. I for lack of a better expression, philosophy was theology's bitch. Like basically, right? Like philosophy was theology's servant. That was the idea, at least. That was sort of the popular conception. Now, when we get to the modern period and we look at figures like Descartes, the focus then becomes not on metaphysics, not on theology even. Descartes claims that, and this is where I think maybe one reason why he does deserve credit as the father of modern philosophy, but he thinks we shouldn't study, like philosophy and scientists should stop doing theology and just focus on philosophy, science, mathematics, geometry, things like that, and leave the theology to the church. And so you get a separation of science and religion, which is very original, which is very unique to Christian Western Europe, right? So first philosophy for Descartes, and you're going to see this in our essay when we finally get to it next lecture. The focus should not be on metaphysics. The focus should not be on theology even. Primarily the focus in modern philosophy, Descartes argues, is epistemology. Okay. Now that's a word I haven't used. I haven't used that word in quite a long time. I think it came up briefly when we were covering the apology. So I don't know. Does anybody remember what that word even means? We did cover it, believe it or not. Who remembers what epistemology is? Remember, so metaphysics studies the nature of reality. Ethics is about right and wrong, actions, how we should treat others. Theology, we just learned, is the study of religion. Epistemology, no one remembers? So I thought I heard somebody about to answer. I guess not.
Isn't it like the study of knowledge?
Good. Yeah, you're right. Exactly. So that's one way you could define it. What is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? And another aspect of epistemology is not just coming up with a theory of what knowledge is, but what gives us justification for making a claim to know something. If I say I know something, what does that mean? And what are the criteria? So how do we define it, and how do we justify it? How do we prove that we actually do know the things that we say that we know? Where does our justification come in? So Descartes thinks that is the first philosophy. That's the first thing we need to focus on, is theories of knowledge. How do you know what you know? How can you ever be certain of anything? And there are, I would argue, historical reasons for this. That leads us to the scientific revolution. Some historians refer to it as the Copernican revolution because there was a scientist named Nikolai Copernicus who was one of the most important figures in this movement, in this revolution, for lack of a better word. But we're coming close to the end of class time, so I'm going to end it there. Let me go ahead and stop recording. But for next meeting, if you didn't hear me earlier, I'll say it again. Read the first meditation, right? It's only 4 pages. So read the first meditation. If you have time, maybe move on even to the second meditation. I have a feeling we might get to that even by the end of class next time. So again, I'm going to stop recording, and you guys can stick around if you have any questions.